Hey Jordan, welcome to the show. Really glad to have you here and catch up with you. How are things over there in LA?
Things are doing great. Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, it's really good. We had connected in LA at VidCon and we're in a panel together and just shared so much about podcasting and specifically for video creators as well, which is a lot of our audience here on this show. And so really excited to pick your brain and really for you to meet our audience here as well. So before we jump in, maybe just take a minute or two and just introduce what you do at Spotify as head of content partnerships there and just tell us a little bit about that. And then, we'll get into the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. I look after content partnerships at Spotify. I've been at the company for 4.5 years. And for us, content partnerships really means looking after the company's relationships with top content creators, with podcasters, individual creators, with publishers, with media companies, with really everyone and anyone who is distributing content on Spotify, really with the goal of helping them find success. And success means something different to everyone, but we try to help with everything, whether that's growing a creator's audience, helping them monetize, helping them adopt new products and features that create a more engaging experience. It really runs the gamut, but I would say the common thread is really that my team partners hand in hand with a wide and diverse range of creators to help them find success on our platform.
That's awesome. And the definition of podcasting is really expanding, right? From a few years ago, even a couple years ago, where it was audio only. And, full transparency, folks out here, you guys know that I host my podcast on Spotify. I have been doing that for many years. And Jordan, the introduction of the video podcast and making that so easy, just uploading essentially what will be this is recorded as a video right now, uploading this to Spotify and having that available as a video is amazing, being a YouTube creator first, in my opinion. And so I'd just love for you to kind of speak on that. Talk to me about the expanding definition of podcasts as you see it with the shift to videos. I don't want to lead the witness, but just your thoughts on the expanding sort of definition of podcasting.
Yeah, we're absolutely seeing podcasts evolve as a medium, which is really exciting because podcasts have been around for a long time. And I think there's a few ways it's evolving, but probably the most prominent is that video is really becoming, for many podcasts, a core part of the experience. And we've seen more and more podcasts start to add a video component, which I think is really exciting because it adds an engaging layer for investing in the video space for is on one hand for existing podcasts, more ways to engage your content. But I think what it's also doing is for content that parts of a podcast, video content that's released on a weekly or bi-weekly basis that has a prominent host. I think it makes Spotify a destination where you can distribute your content and build an audience and make podcasts successful. I think it's such a unique, retentive format. People come back and listen to their podcast week after week. They build really deep relationships with hosts. And I think it's really exciting that the addition of video is really just supercharging all the things that make a podcast.
Yeah, I think what you are mentioning here, sorry, Jordan, we'll pause this here. I'm having a little... Hey, Jordan.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I was getting a bit of a lag there.
Let's move to a new spot and see if the problem's on my side.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. I'm hardwired, so maybe that's... I wonder what's going on.
It's me, is what you're saying.
Let me close out some tabs here as well. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. 1, 2, 3.
And evolve, which is exciting because it's been around for a long time. And I think podcasts are evolving in a few ways, but certainly one of the most prominent ways is really the addition of video to a lot of podcasts. And I think it's really exciting to see a lot of these podcasts embracing video and adding, a really engaging layer for their audience who clearly wants more and wants the opportunity to not just listen to what their favorite host is saying, but also watch them too. So, we've definitely seen a lot of podcasts adding a video component. And, I think it's been really exciting. We have more than 250,000 video podcasts on Spotify, and it's really sort of changing how our users are interacting with content, which is great. I think the other thing it's doing, though, is it's really expanding what is considered a podcast. I think there's a lot of video content out there that probably has a lot of the hallmarks of a podcast. It has a weekly or bi-weekly release cadence. It has a prominent host that builds a relationship with their audience. And I think the addition of video to Spotify really creates an additional distribution destination for a lot of that content, an opportunity to reach an incremental audience that can not only listen to podcasts, but listen to a wide range of video content. And what's so great about Spotify and podcasts in general is that it's really incredible at building a loyal audience. And, by distributing on Spotify and building that connection with our audience, I think you can create an audience that keeps coming back to your show week after week, month after month. And I think that opportunity is something that we're expanding to more creators, which I'm really excited about.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think in that interview with Colin and Samir, you actually mentioned that I think it was 65 or 70% of podcasts now prefer, or their podcast audiences prefer video. I would be in that as well. I do listen to a handful of podcasts, very, very, loyally and religiously each week. And I do like watching their video versions, just to see, because sometimes they'll share, graphics or slides or some type of screen share in those, even the news related ones or more real time. Would you suggest that, new creators even sort of coming out the gates, sort of just implement the podcast already into their workflow, into their content plans?
I think that, when I look at podcasts that are successful, I think the most important thing is for a creator to really trust the creative process. And I think increasingly for a lot of creators, that means adding a video component to your podcast. And so when podcast creators ask me they should add video, I really turn the question back onto them and ask them, what is the right creative decision for your content? Certainly the addition of video, I think, adds a really engaging layer. It also allows you to promote that podcast not only on Spotify, but also on other video platforms, which I think is a really big value add. And then, for video creators that are thinking about starting a podcast, it's definitely something that I encourage. I remind folks, though, that a podcast is something that requires a fair amount of work, and it really means committing to the format, to releasing content on a regular basis, to really building up your audience over time. I think the opportunity, though, is really, really large for those creators that, are willing to put the time and the effort into the podcast space. You can build an incredibly loyal audience that keeps coming back to you week after week and listens to a large amount of your content. I think what's so exciting about podcasts is it's really one of the few long form media formats out there. We're not talking about snackable videos. We're talking about podcasts that sometimes last up to 3 hours. And so, I think it's just such a unique format, the ability to really engage your audience in a long form discussion, the ability to go deep. And so it's definitely something that I encourage all creators to think about.
It's great. It's great. I'm a podcaster, so obviously I love podcasts. I think every creator should have a podcast, even if, maybe their video content on YouTube, for example, doesn't lend to a podcast. Maybe they have a vlog or, they're travel vloggers or whatever they may be, right? I think for the reason that you said, Jordan, that it's long form, that you're really building trust and this relationship with your audience because you're really in their ear for, really long periods of time. And they tend to really start to connect with you and get to know you beyond your surface level content that they're watching on YouTube, for example. I don't know how to position this question, but really what is sort of like, in your opinion, the keys to success? Because there's so many aspects to it for a podcaster or for a podcast show, the personality, and maybe not so much, but it's more the personality, the connection with the host. But in your opinion, what are the key, maybe one or two things that are sort of the top of that list of keys to success for a podcast?
Yeah, what's funny, definitely one of the things that's not at the top of the list is like the production quality. I think some of the best podcasts feel really raw and don't have, really expensive cameras or really glossy sets. So a lot of times people ask if that's necessary, and I think the answer is very much no. But what I think is really important when it comes to the podcast space is there's a few things, but maybe the most important is to have a regular release cadence, to put your content out there week after week, because each time you do that, you you have a chance to build a new audience. And I think one of the things that we know about successful podcasts is that people are listening or watching them in a way that is becoming a habit that's usually affiliated with something else they're doing, whether that's driving to work or, hanging out in the afternoon or trying to wind down. And the more you can get your podcast and your audience to associate the podcast with one of those habits, the more likely they are to come back week after week. And so really ensuring that you're continuing to release your content at the same time is really important. I think the second thing I would say is maybe a sort of more broader point, but particularly for podcasts that are starting out, I think it's certainly important to have a unique perspective that you're bringing to the table. But I also think it's important to iterate and to evolve your content based on feedback from your users. We recently launched the ability for the audience to leave comments on a podcast. And I think what that's done is it's allowed creators to solicit feedback from their audience, really in a way to help them improve their show and adjust their show. And if you're just starting out, I think the ability to really hear what your audience is saying and to put that feedback into action is really important. And so, certainly for podcasts starting out, it's one of the things we really encourage them to do is to engage with the audience to really figure out what they want to listen to. Maybe the third thing is you really, when it comes to the podcast space, have to actively promote your podcast. You can't just sort of put it out there and expect people to find it. There's millions and millions of podcasts out there. And so for those podcasts that are starting out, we really do encourage them to find audience wherever you can get it, to promote it on social, to really make sure you're putting it front and center, and really doing so in a way that describes what your podcast is about in a succinct way. You can imagine there's a lot of podcasts out there, and when people are browsing for podcasts, sometimes the only thing they have to make that decision is a small square cover art or a description of the show. And sometimes that's not quite enough to get people to really take a chance. And so, really encourage people to describe their podcast, to really make sure that their audience knows what to expect so that you can get people to start listening or watching.
I love that. Those are great. That's great advice. I really resonate with what you just said about the comments as well. I was really excited when I saw that with Spotify and people can leave comments now. In the past, it was sort of like this broadcast where you're talking to your audience and they could DM you or email you. But you guys have made that really easy, and it's a fantastic way to sort of get this engagement back and forth and hear from your audience. Yeah. And I like that. Yeah. Production quality is probably, I agree with you, is probably the lowest on the sort of that pole of priorities. In the early days, Jordan, believe it or not, I used to actually just record on my phone because with Spotify, you could just record directly.
Totally.
There's
a lot of creators who started their video podcast just recording on two phones. And honestly, it kind of works. I think the hardest thing about a podcast is starting out. And I think people get intimidated sometimes. I think the truth is there's no reason not to start and use what you have. You don't need a complicated setup. Definitely encourage people to just start putting their content out there. Start with audio if you want, but it's just as easy to add a video component too.
Yeah.
And it doesn't need to be fancy and it doesn't need to be expensive.
No, absolutely. I'm going to show you a little, but this Spotify mic that we got from VidCon last year, I still use this and I would just attach it to my phone, and when I'm traveling, this is the podcast, my phone, and this is my studio. So I totally agree with you. I think that's the way to go with podcasting, and that raw, authentic conversation almost with your audience is so good and so key to everything that you're doing. Let's talk a little bit about the promotion, discovery of a podcast. A lot of the folks here, Jordan, are YouTube creators, and so they understand the world of algorithm and keywords and all of that stuff. With podcasting, that's not how it works, right? Like you mentioned, you're promoting it and then bringing people to your podcast. So I think it's both with podcasts. I think certainly on Spotify, we have a lot of services where we are recommending podcasts, where we are promoting podcasts to users. And so I do think there is an algorithmic aspect to this for sure. And to that end, as you think about optimization,
I think that's why having really effective cover art and show descriptions and episode descriptions is really important. You need to make sure that all of the assets you're putting out there for your podcast clearly describe what the show is about. And that really helps optimize it for all the various recommendation services that your show could appear on Spotify. But I also think that podcast as a format is also something that creators need to actively promote. Because it's a long form medium, you're asking a lot of someone to come listen to anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours of content per week. And so because it's a big ask, you really do need to lean into promotion as well. And so I think one of the great things about video is it just adds an extra layer of promotion that you can use as a creator to get your podcast out there, to not only promote it on Spotify, but use all social platforms available. And I think that increasingly people are discovering new podcasts on Spotify, but also on other platforms. And I think that's great. And, what's great about those platforms is people can watch a clip of your podcast and then they get hooked and they'll come to Spotify to listen to the whole thing. And I think that's a really great user journey.
Yeah, it's actually, now that you say that, you're right. I do catch and discover new shows as I'm scrolling through on the podcast tab on my Spotify app. So you're absolutely right. And I'm always very surprised as I scroll through my Instagram stories as well, that like some of the creators that I follow on video, on Instagram, on YouTube have launched podcasts. And so I kind of end up there as well. So definitely that strategy definitely works.
Yeah, listen, I think a lot of creators have started podcasts. A lot of creators have started distributing their long form content on Spotify, even if they don't consider it a podcast. Both are legitimate. And that's maybe the other thing I would say to creators thinking about starting a podcast. If you have long form video content that you're putting out on a regular basis, put it on Spotify and see what happens. I think that if it has a lot of the hallmarks of a podcast, it has a chance to really do well. And it's definitely something that we encourage. Once you build an audience on Spotify, it's easy to launch new podcasts and cross promote.
I love that. Community comments you guys have started. Your thoughts on community for podcasters? How do you kind of see that? How do you advise creators, even larger creators like Colin and Samir that you guys work with, like those types of creators?
Yeah.
How do you kind of advise them and help them navigate building a community around their show?
I think the truth is podcasting could be kind of a lonely experience, particularly if you don't have a co-host. A lot of times you're speaking into a microphone and you don't really know what's on the other end of that. I think that it's great that we launched comments because it allows for a little bit more of a two-way conversation between a host and their audience. But even still, as a podcaster, you don't really know how any other podcast is doing. It's not like other social platforms where there's view counts and you can sort of clearly see if you're being successful. A lot of successful podcasts don't even know that they're successful. And so a lot of what my team tries to focus on is building inroads with podcasters to really help them not only connect with Spotify, but connect with each other through different events and activations that we have, really trying to ensure that there's a support network for all these great content creators that sometimes might otherwise feel like they're speaking into the void. And certainly I think that's been boosted by a lot of the advancements in, engagement that we've launched. I think comments being the most obvious one. But I think the great thing about the podcast space is there are a lot of meetups and a lot of opportunities to meet fellow podcasters and really share tips and tricks. Some of them we put on and a lot of others just exist in the community. So it's definitely something we encourage. We try to get our podcasters to connect with other podcasters and really share best practices, tips, and tricks. It's great that the podcast medium is evolving, that there's new engagement tactics like comments and video, but it also means that as a podcaster, you need to sort of stay on top of all of it. And the best way to do that, I think, is to connect with other podcasters.
I love it. I'm all about that as well. The last thing I really want to kind of pick your brain about is, as creators get more, established with their podcast, monetization, right? Monetization. You guys have some ways to monetize with subscribers and sort of paid content within Spotify, like natively, which is amazing. But yeah, how do you guys navigate and help creators on that side with the monetization?
Yeah, listen, I think for anyone creating content, monetization is usually top of mind, which is totally fair. And what's great is I think we've launched a lot of ways for creators to monetize through a few different channels. I think the one that probably comes to mind most immediately is advertising. And on Spotify for podcasters, our hosting platform for creators, you can easily upload your content. You can distribute it to Spotify as video or audio, depending on sort of what your podcast is. And you can also distribute it to all the other platforms out there that support audio content. But it also allows you to monetize. And we have a program that essentially places ads in your content. You decide where you want the ad to appear and a few other things. And essentially, once you build an audience, the program can really help you monetize that audience by serving ads. And it's a simple sort of self-service program that really allows for programmatic monetization. For some folks, advertising isn't the right way to monetize, or they don't just want to monetize with advertising. They want to have subscription service. They want to put some content behind a paywall, maybe bonus content. And we have a lot of options for those creators as well. We have a podcast subscription product that you can use in Spotify for podcasters. We also have integrations with big membership platforms like Patreon and Substack, so that if you do want to sign up with one of those programs, you can actually put your gated content on Spotify. And when a user comes to it, they'll see the content with a little lock. And when they click the lock, we send them to that platform, Patreon, Substack, or one of the others to authenticate. And so for us, it's really about ensuring that we're getting your audience to you and helping you monetize them in a bunch of different ways. And certainly for bigger creators and even smaller creators, finding out, how to monetize that content can be a really important ingredient to ensure that you stick with it. And it's definitely something that we're going to continue to invest in.
That's awesome. I'm so happy to hear that. I think monetization is so key. And we talk a lot about that on this show, is that, creators that are making money, have sustainable businesses is good for everybody, better quality content.
Totally.
Just good for everyone. So,
even though podcasting is not the most expensive thing necessarily, it takes a lot of time. And I think that creators need to be compensated for that time and that effort that they're putting in week after week. And so, I would definitely keep looking at Spotify, because we're going to find more and better ways to help creators monetize their content through a bunch of different channels.
I love that. Is there, the direction that Spotify is going, which is fantastic. You guys are very connected with creators and, the podcasting, obviously Spotify's massive. There's music, there's all sorts of things, but there's audiobooks, but just the creators in the podcasting space, you guys are so well connected within the community. Like I said, you are at VidCon. I see you guys everywhere doing, activations and community activities. Just curious if there's anything that you can share as like, product roadmap or things that are coming down the pipes that we can kind of share with this audience publicly that might be, of value.
Yeah, look, I think I would say two things. I think we've spoken a lot about video. We've been investing in video for a number of years, but I would expect video to be even more front and center in the app, really ensuring that if you are a podcast that adds a video component, that we are merchandising and highlighting that video content as much as possible. Because I think we know that that video component can be a really successful way to get a new user to engage with a podcast, to get someone who maybe used to listen but no longer listens to come back to a podcast. So I would look at that space and expect to see more development there. And then the other thing I would say is, I think on the monetization side, we're already doing a lot, but I would expect us to do even more to help creators monetize their content on Spotify. I think finding ways to ensure that creators see an ROI on the content they're putting out there will ensure that they keep creating for a longer time, that they create higher quality content. And so to your point before, I think it's a win-win, and it's definitely something that we'll keep focusing on.
Awesome. Jordan, thank you so much for your time. Monetization and more video for podcasts, which is easy for this audience because we're already making videos. So this is fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. What's the best way to connect with you or kind of see what's happening, changes, updates on the Spotify, in the Spotify world?
Yeah, we have a lot of services for people. We have a resources hub on the Spotify for Podcasters website that has all the latest information on recent products, features, interviews with creators, and a whole lot more for folks looking to hear the latest.
Awesome. All right. I'll link to all of that. Jordan, thank you so much for your time. Hopefully we'll see you again at some point in LA, and we'll talk to you all very soon.
All right. Thanks for having me.